Ladies and gentlemen, here we are. Welcome back to another podcast. Welcome back to another Friday Night Live. I am, like I always say, I'm very excited. I'm excited tonight, especially not only because I got a couple really cool guests on. I got one of my favorite guests that I've ever had on, and always love to have him back on. I've got a new guest on that I think is going to be a phenomenal perspective, and I think we're going to get into a topic tonight that you guys know I love to ruffle feathers. It's one of my favorite things to do on this podcast, and I love to make people think critically. And so I think tonight we're definitely going to ruffle some feathers and probably think a little bit critically. But tonight I am joined by no other than Mr. John Hammonds, fisheries biologist for the TWRA, and then also Mr. Lawrence Dorsey. Did I say that correctly?
That's correct. Yeah,
that is correct. And you are a fisheries biologist for what is North Carolina's DNR called?
Yeah, so we're called the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So
there you go. See, every state has something real fancy, and I always forget. DNR is always your fallback. You know what's funny about that though? The first time I ever went outside of the state of Tennessee, because you got like the Alabama, wildlife, whatever, and then the Georgia, same thing. Well, then the first time I ever went to Michigan, my buddy's like, "That's the DNR guy." And I'm like, the do not resuscitate guy? I was like, who is that? He's like, no, the Department of Natural Resources. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So yeah, the first time I ever heard DNR was when I went up north. So, but no, I'm so glad that you guys are both here. Tonight we're going to talk about a really kind of vexing topic, which is the Alabama bass. And we're going to kind of dive into that. But before we do that, John, I want you to kind of introduce yourself, give your credentials. I know we've done this before 1,000 times, but I always like to just kind of reiterate it for people who don't know you, kind of where you come from, what you do. And then, Lawrence, I'll let you do the same. Okay, buddy?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. First, I think I've mentioned this before, but I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk about what we do, and appreciate all the guys who buy licenses and stuff to come fish Tennessee. We have a good place to go, and equally as so does North Carolina. And we both have tremendous resources, different but both good. So my name is John Hammonds, and I'm a fisheries biologist for Tennessee Wildlife. And like you said, that's equivalent to a lot of states' DNRs or whatever they happen to call them. I started off in fisheries world in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, managing trout, and we did a lot of restoration work up there with native fishes, not only trout but other native fishes, some of the minnow and darter species, and the Smokies and the National Park Service in particular. They like to manage for native fishes and do restoration where they can. And fishing is actually one of the very few consumptive activities that the national park allows. So fishing was a part of that. We had size and krill limits up there, and then I jumped right in from cold water streams to warm water reservoirs. So it was a little bit of a switch, and that happened in 2004. And been doing that work since then for the Tennessee Wildlife in East Tennessee. And we have about 13 reservoirs. We manage the fisheries and the habitat and the data collection, the krill survey, and all those reservoirs. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have had an interview from a krill clerk, and that gives us important information to make decisions on about, size and krill limits. We can get angler opinion data, and what folks are there fishing for. And we don't want to spend a lot of effort managing a fishery that nobody's really using. So that gives us the chance to do that. So yeah, that's what we do.
There you go. It's awesome. I love the krill surveys because there's this one guy, and I always forget his name, but I see him every now and again. And I'm out on the water a lot, so I run into him probably more than often, more than most people do. And he's like awesome. I always end up having like a 2-hour conversation with him, and it has nothing to do with fishing, just everything to do with everything but fishing. Like we go down every rabbit hole conceivable to man, and it's always a good one. But yeah, Lawrence, tell the people about yourself, my friend.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a regional fisheries supervisor right now with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. I got my undergrad in fisheries and wildlife science from North Carolina State in 1995. And shortly thereafter, I moved to Cookeville, Tennessee, and did a 2-year master's research project at Tennessee Tech. Fun fact for the night, John and I actually went to grad school together, so we've known each other for a long, long time. So it's good to be on here with him tonight. And I worked on Normandy Reservoir, looking at native spotted bass and largemouth bass and their dynamics, the young of the year dynamics of that fish. It was a 5-year project that I was fortunate enough to work on with some other folks that are still around in the fisheries world. And then coming out of grad school, I was fortunate enough to get on here with our state agency, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. My first job was a assistant district biologist, and I worked in Northwest North Carolina, the Winston-Salem, Boone, New River area, the headwaters of the New River, which is pretty cool. I did that for almost 3 years, and then the bulk of my career has been in the Piedmont, North Carolina. I was a district biologist for 19 years, covered the Catawba River, which is Lake James, Lake Hickory, Lake Norman, Lake Wiley, and also the Yadkin River. Spent a lot of time on the Yadkin River, which is High Rock Lake, Lake Tillery, Baden Lake. In 2019, I moved into a research coordinator role and did that for, again, almost about 3 years. And just in the last couple of years, I became regional supervisor. So I don't get on the water as much as I used to. I spend a lot of time doing the admin type stuff, but I'm still connected to it, and been involved a lot in this Alabama bass issue over the last 20 years. It's probably not something I thought I was going to get into, but it's like anything else in fisheries. You don't know what's coming a lot of time, and you kind of have to roll with the punches. So glad to be here tonight and appreciate the opportunity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love having you guys on because I was a former educator and I taught elementary school. And one of the things that I always told my kids was be a lifelong learner. And when I put myself around people who are a lot more educated than I am on a certain subject, I feel like I can arm myself with the tools that I need to be just a little bit more educated in that subject. And so that's why I have you guys on to talk about stuff like the Alabama bass. And I think it's going to be a fun conversation. I do have to say, though, Western North Carolina, I've spent quite a bit of time there going to some little sneaky lakes that you guys have, and they are fun, to say the least. Like, there are some really cool opportunities in Western North Carolina and Far East Tennessee to get into some pretty exciting stuff, especially if you're willing to throw a big glide bait around. Because when you get a bunch of spotted bass and a bunch of smallmouth and a bunch of largemouth that get used to eating trout, they'll try to mess up on a big glide bait, and so that's a ton of fun. I've had North Carolina has provided me with a ton of fun, not only on the very westerly side of North Carolina, but all the way in the east too, in the red fishing. I got a buddy who's a red fishing guide, and so literally, I told him the first time I ever did, I'd never caught a redfish. And first redfish he puts me on is 45 inches long. And I told him, I said, well, I would sell everything that I have and move down here and start red fishing like today if we could do it. And so, yeah, North Carolina's a cool place. It's got some cool memories in it. But so let's dive right into this thing. So I guess the best way to start this is kind of outline what is an Alabama spotted bass, and kind of outline all the different names that I've heard it called as well. Because I've heard it called a Coosa River spotted bass. I've heard it called an Alabama bass, an Alabama spotted bass, and then some people just call them a spotted bass. But there's a clear definition between like what I consider a Kentucky spotted bass, or like a native spotted bass, and then these non-native Alabama, I guess, strain spotted bass. So John, Lawrence, either one of y'all kind of just want to explain like, what is that fish that we're talking about?
Yeah, I'll jump in and then I'll let John, if he certainly got anything to add on it. So you're correct in about everything you said, because it's kind of gone all over the place. For a long time, they were considered a subspecies of spotted bass. So there was, the northern spotted bass, which is the Kentucky, which is really now just the spotted bass. When you think about genetics and species names and what really is a spotted bass, that's the Kentucky. That a lot of people think about. That's what Tennessee is, native to Tennessee, native to Western North Carolina. And then the Alabama bass, like I said, was a subspecies up until about 2008. Some folks that do fish taxonomy, which is really the classification of fishes, a little bit more in-depth study of fish than John and I do. We're fisheries managers. They looked at it and they were able to, through just identification characteristics, and I'm not quite sure, there probably wasn't some genetics involved. Certainly nowadays there are, in separating that species out, Alabama bass, into its own species. So it's now its own species. It's not a subspecies. And that didn't come into effect really until about 2008. I just had to check that before I got on here tonight, that was kind of when that time frame happened, where it was made its own species. It's native to really what I would consider the Alabama River drainage, which is the Coosa and the Tallapoosa. Think about all those Coosa River reservoirs in North Alabama. There's a little bit of streams that drain into the Mobile Bay in Mississippi, a little bit in Georgia, and I think there might be a little fringe up in the very top or very southeast corner of Tennessee that also drains in there, but not much in Tennessee. So anytime you get out of that range, that fish has been introduced. And, we get into it as we go, I know, but right now, and I haven't really plotted it, it's something we're going to be working on, but the introduced range of that fish is greater than the native range right now. But best I can tell, it's at least equal, if not greater. It's expanded greatly in the last 30 years, but certainly in the last 10 to 15.
Yeah. It's crazy. And I'm seeing it like, and me and John, one of our favorite words to use is anecdotal, but my anecdotal experience of being out on the water 40 hours a week. I mean, I got the coolest job in the world where I get to fish all the time. I'm seeing these things pop up literally everywhere. Like they are literally in it's some places like I'm like, how did what was the process that they got to get here? And like you said, a lot of it is human introduction. And so, yeah, it is. And we'll get into that more. And they are spreading dramatically. And it's kind of crazy to see the proliferation of that fish. John, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I was hoping Lawrence is going to take that because everybody can hear a different perspective. So you were mentioning the different names, and there's quote official common names that we use as managers and biologists, and those can be found through the American Fisheries Society. They update it, I don't know, every few years. But the official common name, from what I understand, is Alabama bass. But from what I understand also, most people call them coosa spots, at least around here. So, but Lawrence is right about the tiny native range. They do have a native range in Tennessee. It's the Conasauga River, and it's pretty much a small creek, a medium-sized river. I'm sorry, small river, large creek. Went down in that part of the country. So we do have a small range, but they're not native anywhere else but that little tiny speck in the corner of the state.
Yeah. We actually did a 10-mile float on the Conasauga the other day. A video will be out Sunday, and I ended up catching a couple big ones on glide baits. And it's what we were talking about, and they're good there because that doesn't flow in the Tennessee River system in any way. And that makes it where, it's good for those to be native there. It's good for them to live there because it's not going to ultimately affect our natural population of smallmouth and all that. And again, we'll get into all that here in just a second. But when we're thinking about Alabama bass, Coosa River spotted bass, whatever, what terminology we want to use, because they do have a bunch of different names. What has seemed to be the primary source of introduction into the places where they're not supposed to be? Actually, let me back up a little bit. Let me ask this question first. So is the Alabama spot kind of like a shoal bass in the fact that it's got like a small native range and they're just like a very specific fish? Like what was the evolutionary process that divided them out from a largemouth or another spot? Like what was it about where they live that turned them into what they are?
You might be getting a lot of my depth on this one here, but if you look at that Alabama, Georgia area for black basses, which is largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass. Now we've got Chattahoochee bass, shoal bass, red-eye bass. Alabama, Georgia, and that mountainous region, South Carolina, it's got a huge biodiversity for black bass. So somewhere in the evolution of those fish, there was something that went on there evolutionary wise that didn't go on in other places that just only have, say, smallmouth bass and largemouth bass and maybe spotted bass, maybe Kentucky spotted bass. And so, it's one of these things that's kind of been a little bit of a race over time, right? In that as scientists go in and they study all this and they find all these different species and they're able to separate them out, at the same time, we have these invasive species that are getting in there that are hybridizing with these things. In some cases before they can even really separate them out. But genetics have played a big part in being able to separate these fish out. I mean, there's physical characteristics in a lot of them, but there's also a lot of genetics work that kind of backs up the physical characteristic separation. So the exact reason why there's all those different species down there, I'm probably a little out of my league, but that area is very biodiverse. The funny thing is for whatever reason, and I don't know if anyone's tried it, I hope they don't, I hope they won't, moving some of these other fish, shoal bass and Bartram's bass and that out of those areas, you don't see the impact you've seen with Alabama bass. It's very strange and a little unknown as to why they do so well in such a wide range of environments, which, is a good thing if you're looking at survival, but in this case, it's not a good thing because we don't really want them outside of their native range. So.
Yeah, it's very interesting. A spot in general, both the Kentucky and the Alabama they're super hardy, and they live in the strangest places that you would never think that you would find a bass. And like one thing, and John knows this, one thing that I've been doing a lot the past couple of years is exploring these little creeks and areas around my house, like places you wouldn't even think fish would live. And there's two things that I've found in that area: a lot of Kentucky spotted bass, a lot of Alabama spotted bass, and then muskies. Like it's amazing. It's amazing how those two things. I think it, again, anecdotal, but I think it has just something to do with this how aggressive they are. I think that they're like, it's like you've got a largemouth and a smallmouth, and they're kind of, a smallmouth's a little bit higher in the kind of competitive aggressiveness level, and then largemouth's a little bit more lazy. And then it's like you got like a spotted bass, and they're up here and they're pissed off at every single thing that moves, and they try to kill every single thing that moves. And I think that kind of helps them just in being able to live where other stuff maybe wouldn't live. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, one thing we saw this with spotted bass when I did research years ago, and I think there's no doubt that Kentucky spotted bass and Alabama are now the Alabama bass.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty related ecologically. One thing we've seen is that their spawning depths, the depths they nest at, largemouth bass typically shallower, smallmouth deeper. If you plotted their range, the Alabama bass definitely would overlap that quite a bit. Just from what we've seen, again, a lot of anecdotal stuff. Hoping in the future to maybe do some research to kind of pin all that down, but that seems to be the best explanation. One of the better explanations as to how they're able to kind of take over these systems as quickly as they have. They just got a wide variety of spawning habitats they can be in, depth-wise and substrate-wise and things like that, whereas smallmouth and largemouth seems to be a little bit tighter on their requirements.
Yeah, and I've also noticed it, and me and John's talk about this anecdotally again, but I've noticed it is they'll spawn at a bunch of different temperatures too. Like smallmouth are like 55 to 60, largemouth 65, 60 to 65. Those spots I've seen them spawning in 80-degree water before. I mean, like literally two of them on a bed circling each other, like, and caught them off of the bed that they were making. And I think they just maybe kind of like a bluegill or, some other fish. They just don't care. Like they're the strangest fish to interact with and to deal with because, like I said, they can be hyperly aggressive, but then there's also times that they're just the most passive thing in the water. And I've seen them spawn at I've seen them eat a bunch of different things. They're just interesting. They're interesting fish. I mean, they're really a cool kind of creature. It's just not cool where they're at and what they're doing. And so, you got anything to add? I got some time out down here.
Yeah, so I'm so sorry my microphone's messing up, but so as a general rule, most things in nature that are more of a generalist and have a wide variety, like Lawrence was mentioning, the depth of the spawn, where they spawn and the temperatures and all that, they typically do very well when they're moved around, and they also have that built-in adaptability to different environments, and that's one of the things that Alabama bass definitely have. And it's cool that Lawrence pointed that out. I didn't realize that was a piece of information we had yet. I probably read it somewhere and forgotten, but yeah, that's just one thing when you think about how critters do their thing is the more broad they are, usually the better the more adaptable they are, which the better they are at moving outside their natural home, their native range.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating, like I said. So going back to what I was going to get into before I kind of got into that original question, because you're right, Lawrence, there's a ton of different black bass in Georgia, like northern Alabama, northern Georgia. It's fascinating. And especially when you go below kind of where the shoal bass live, there's like that drop. I forgot, it's got a name, but it's like where you drop off of,
fault line, probably.
Yeah, it's like a fault line. Like you drop off the kind of mountainous region of northern Georgia and drop into that kind of lowland stuff. Like there's so many different bass that you can go catch. I got a buddy that actually has an Instagram, and he's gone and like tried to catch them all. And he's at like number like 25 or something like that. And it is cool. I mean, it's a cool thing, but the biodiversity is fascinating there. But to get kind of back to my original statement, what seems to be the number one mechanism to which is playing into what's moving these fish around? Like what's the number one mechanism?
Well, I mean, I could talk about North Carolina, and I'll let John talk about Tennessee. I mean,
Yeah.
for us, get a little bit of history here. I mean, I'm not sure it was the first instance because we'll never know when the first instance is somebody brought them in. But for us, kind of the epicenter has been Lake Norman, huge reservoir outside of Charlotte. It's the biggest reservoir we have in the States, like 32,000 acres. For years, there was a lot of that reservoir is an interesting reservoir because it's huge. It's in the Piedmont, but it really functions more like, and I was trying to think about it in analogous to, it's like Norris to me in Tennessee, and that it's big reservoir, but it's very unproductive, or it's oligotrophic. You probably talked about that on the show maybe once or twice before, but low productivity. So there was this expectation from anglers when it was impounded in the 60s that it's going to be this great bass lake, largemouth bass lake, and it's never been that. And there's other lakes, within an hour's drive that are great. Lake Wiley, is a great lake for largemouth or above average lake. And so there was a lot of angler discontent in the 60s on into the 70s. And in the 80s, they kind of caught wind of these guys catching these Alabama spots down in the Coosa River that were a spotted bass, but that were getting 4 or 5, maybe up to 6 pounds. And they're kind of like, well, if largemouth aren't doing their job here, why not bring something else in? And it was in that transition period where fisheries agencies were getting away from moving everything everywhere and trying it. There was a lot of that went on in the 50s and 60s and kind of had tapered off by that point. And we told the anglers, this is not a good idea. We don't think you need to do this. And again, there was a lot of other discontent with other fisheries at Norman. And about 2000, 2001, kind of had gotten some wind that people might have moved some fish. And lo and behold, we started picking them up at Norman. And then, the more we looked and the more we did our routine surveys over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen them in multiple places. And like I was telling you in the pre-show, the difference with us in North Carolina is we've got a lot of Atlantic slope rivers that aren't connected. I don't have the count right off the top, but it's at least 5 or 6 different major basins that we have that aren't connected. So for a fish to get from one basin to another, it's got to be physically moved by somebody. And that's not been us. So it's people moving them. The Ys are doing that. I think I know some of the answers, but some of them, I don't know that. You have to pin each person down that's done it. So
yeah, it's interesting. And I was saying in the green room before we started, we have a lot of love for the spotted bass in Tennessee. A lot of the people that I talk about, they love them because they're cool. I mean, like you said, you get a spot's 4, 5, 6, 7 pounds. I mean, I think we're going to see an 8-pounder within the next couple of years here in Tennessee. You hook into that, it's something special. And I mean, I love to catch them because they're stupid aggressive. They're stupid in general. And you catch a 4 or 5 pound one, and they're awesome in kayak tournaments. If you don't, Lawrence, you may not be familiar with kayak tournaments, but we don't do weight, we do length. And so I can catch a 2.5 pound spotted bass that's 18.5 inches long. And so I love them in a good kayak tournament too, because they win kayak tournaments and they don't have to be very big, but all at the same time. And we'll get into this, kind of the effect that they have on these fisheries is sad. And I think a lot of people don't see it that way. It's very interesting. They just see it as, well, who cares if we get this cool thing that we can catch? And I think it's kind of like, it's kind of like the hog problem that we see in Texas and some of these other places. Like I've talked to people that live in Texas, and some people are like, oh, the hogs suck. They're destroying farms, destroying. Then other people are like, oh yeah, I got a helicopter hog hunting business. I hope they never go anywhere because I'm making 6 figures a year flying a helicopter around letting people shoot hogs. And so it's this weird balance, this weird act that we play. But John, go ahead and kind of explain where kind of the same question. Where is the main mechanism for where ours are coming from?
Yeah, so the epicenter for us would be, I guess, to be analogous to North Carolina would be Parksville. It was somewhat of a success story. It was pretty much a, off the grid. Really, no need to go there to catch for bass fishing. And someone brought Alabama bass in there. Is the only way we can explain how they got there. Was an angler or just somebody who maybe wasn't an angler, but likely an angler. And there's trout stocking we do there. And that's a good food source, for them. And not that we stock trout for that at all, but they're pretty much a easy target. So they grew big, and then the state record got broken there. I think 3 times, and it now is up to like 8 or 9 pounds. And it just became like, oh goodness, this is how we save our, declining fisheries in these reservoirs that are 60, 70, 80 years old, now approaching 100 years old. And they just, from there, just got moved around. Watts Bar was probably a close second to the Parksville for where the most numerous are. And, in the first generation or two, they do pretty well. But what we've noticed across the Southeast is the success stories, if you want to call it that, are very few. Less than 5, and the horror stories are the rest of them, which are 20, 30. I don't even know the total number. I've got a few written down, the major ones, but I would guess there's at least 20 reservoirs that's just been the population of smallmouth that just crashed, or is in the process of crashing. Watts Bar would be in the process. Tellico is on the way, and then Chickamauga, we don't really know where that's going. There's definitely a lot in there. So, and then they've popped up in Cheatham and Old Hickory now in the Cumberland system, and that's kind of scary because Dale Hollow's in the Cumberland. And the other thing that's happened, and I know I'm swaying a little bit off the original question, but the other thing that's happening is in Lawrence's neck of the woods, they're making a little U-shape around into Virginia, and that's going around South Holston and Watauga, and anybody that fishes up there knows that South Holston is a fantastic, and so is Watauga smallmouth fishery.
Yeah.
And if you like to fish for smallmouth, if they're in there, they're going to be gone. That's just the way it is to it.
Well, I'll go ahead and tell you right now. If I found out Alabama bass are in Watauga, I may scream and cry and rip my hair out and just have to go find somebody to fight out in the middle of the street, because Watauga is special. It's straight up. It's probably one of the most special reservoirs that we have in East Tennessee, as far as not only smallmouth but largemouth. I mean, that place is special. But yeah, it's so I'm gonna say something, and my views do not reflect Lawrence's and John's at all, and they don't reflect either one of the agencies that they work for. But I am gonna tell you guys a little story. So our Alabama spotted bass, and the stories that I've heard and the things that I've heard, again, these are stories and I guess rumors. We'll go rumors, right? And Ron Gomer says this is rabbit hole number 1, and he's right. Lawrence, you've never been on one of my podcasts, but we do go down rabbit holes, buddy. We will go down about 15 tonight. I can promise you that.
We're good. We're all good.
Yeah. So yeah, Parksville. And I think that the obsession with Parksville was they knew that it was the people who came together that I think brought these bass in. And again, I'm not going to say any names, but the people who brought these bass in, they were seeing what was happening on Bullard's Bard. And Bullard's Bard was this big, thing that everybody was looking at during kind of this time period back, it was like 2010 to 2013 time frame, maybe a little before, maybe a little after. And, and there's some people who have their ear to the fishing world like I do that was seeing it a little bit before. And I mean, we're seeing 10, 12, 13, 14 pound Alabama spotted bass coming out of Bullard's Bard in California. And a lot of those people, the main thing that they saw that was creating those fish was not climate or environment or the lake or mineral content or anything like that. They just saw trout, Alabama bass that come together. We make 13-pound spots. And it's short-sighted and stupid, in my opinion. It's ignorant. I guess ignorant's a better word, not to be mean, but I am mean. It's ignorant. You're just not seeing the full ramifications of what you're going to do. And so I think they picked Parksville because it was trout and it was Alabama bass. If they come together, they're going to make giants. And, I mean, it has made some really big fish. But what we're seeing now, and John, we've talked about this, Lawrence, I'm sure you guys have seen it over in North Carolina, is we're seeing, it's like you saw this giant spike of giants, and I think we're starting to peak. Like I said, I think we're going to see an 8, 9, 10-pound one, and then I think it's going to crash off, kind of just like Bullard's Bard did. Now it is extremely, extremely hard to go out there and catch a teener size Alabama spot out of Bullard's Bard, because now there's 6,000 2-pounders, and all those big ones have, died off, or just kind of, there's not as many of them. And it's basic fish biology. You can only have so many pounds of fish per acre. And these Alabama bass are really good at making babies. And, if they're making thousands and thousands of babies and they proliferate as well as they do, then eventually that size class is going to crash, because we've got way too many bass per acre that is consuming way too much food. And so that from what my understanding was, like you said, John, is where it started. And it was a small group of people who thought that they could be the biologist and thought that they understood science, we'll call it, because whatever they did was not science. Maybe Bill Nye science, but I don't know if it was real science. And then from there, it carried on to, like you said, Watts Bar. And Watts Bar, Watts Creek specifically, is where again, these are stories that I've been told, was where 5-gallon buckets full of these Alabama bass were gone and introduced there. And there's still some remnants of those big ones that were brought there originally. They're there. I've gone and caught them. I mean, there's, biggest one I've ever caught out there was 5.5 pounds. John, I'd never texted you and told you this, but I saw one there this year it was one of the biggest Alabama spots I've ever seen in my whole entire life. And it was on the bed with about a 12-inch smallmouth. And so very interesting to see. And so that's, again, that's was my experience. That's my anecdotal experience of where I saw it happen and kind of why I think that it happened. And that's where the sentiment comes from a lot of anglers, is they want to grow these giant bass, but they don't understand that California, Texas, and Florida, I always say they're their own little worlds when it comes to bass fishing, because they have some crazy, very huge macro level things like the environment, the climate, all of these things that play into growing giant bass that we just don't have here in Tennessee. And so I don't know. That's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out from here. But to kind of go into the next question, what makes it genetically, and you may be able to answer, may not, what makes it genetically where they can spawn with a smallmouth? Like, how it seems like two very different polar opposite fish. Like, what is the mechanism that makes it where they can spawn with a smallmouth?
Well, so one thing too, and we get asked this a lot, is do they spawn with largemouth? And the answer to that is yes, but to a much lesser degree. In our genetic surveys, we've seen, and even before we kind of were using genetics, at Norman in the early days of the invasion, so from 2000 to 2006, 7, that time frame, we would pick up a few Alabama, because there weren't spotted bass in the lake. They're not smallmouth bass in Norman. And we do, like I said, West North Carolina is a whole different story, because we'll talk about that with the smallmouth, because that's where our smallmouth populations are. But in the Piedmont where I'm at, we really don't have any smallmouth, so it's all largemouth interactions. But we did see some hybridization with that. But these lakes now that they've been in there 15, 20 years, we don't see that. And so what we think goes on there is that the largemouth, again, spawn at shallow end of the spectrum. And once the Alabama bass get in there and kind of more or less run them out of that area when it comes to spawning, there just aren't any largemouth in there to spawn with. Mm-hmm. And so with smallmouth, there are smallmouth there. The depths do overlap, and they're the same genus. They're different species, but they're closely enough related that it's not like trying to spawn a Alabama bass with a muskie, for instance, or a walleye. Mm-hmm. So there's that genetically related, just like with bluegills and other sunfish. They're the same genus, and you will get hybrid. You can create hybrid sunfish. Aquaculture people do, where you can see it in the wild. So really what it boils down to is, are they close enough genetically, which they are, is at the genus level, and then do their habitats overlap when it comes to spawning? And that's kind of what we're seeing is more or less the death knell, we think, at least what we're seeing right now. And I think John can confirm this is, with smallmouth is it may be proliferation. There are just a lot of Alabama bass out there, but when it comes to smallmouth, they're genetically swamping them out. And so not only are they out competing them from just population level, but they're going at it genetically too, which they're not really doing with largemouth. It's more of a habitat thing with largemouth.
Yeah, and John, I'll let you go, but I just want to hit on one thing with the habitat thing. And John, we've seen this. What's fascinating with the spots on Parksville specifically is you can go to the very backs of the creeks and catch largemouth still. All the largemouth are giant. Like, you're going to go catch big ones. And it's like, that's something that we know that we can go do. Like, hey, we're going to go fish this creek mouth or the back of this creek, and we throw glide baits and we catch big largemouth, and then we can go out on the main points and throw the glide baits and catch the spots. And it's like, they just literally force them out. It's like, hey, you can't live here anymore. And like I said earlier, it's just that basic biology of you can only have so many pounds of fish per square acre. and it's literally like they outcompeted them in that area. But John, go on. I interrupted you. I just wanted to
No,
put out.
you're fine. No, Lawrence touched on that. In Lake Norman, that's exactly what's happened there too. And Parksville's the same. They just get pushed up in the creeks. But what I was talking about this the other day, and I think I mentioned on here. But so Alabama bass or Coosa spots grew up, separated from smallmouth bass.
Mm.
So they've never developed a reproductive barrier. And our native spots or Kentucky bass, they grew up with smallmouth. So if there was that much hybridization between the two species, there wouldn't be two species.
Mm-hmm.
Their genes would just mix until there was one species. And that's kind of how one of the modes that speciation works.
Mm.
So when you put an animal into a population where, like Lawrence said, the sunfish family especially, they readily hybridize, and then there's no reproductive barriers that's been established, then that's what you have is what we're seeing is the smallmouth and spotted readily hybridize. And whatever causes that, is a mystery to me at least. And but it happens, and it happens so much so that within just a few short years, your smallmouth are gone, or the population is totally diluted with Alabama bass genes. And Lawrence can speak way more intelligently than me with the examples, but like Parksville in 2001, we found, I think, 2 individual spotted bass, and by the time 2010 was here, the majority of fish in that reservoir were Alabama spots. So the similar things happen with smallmouth, and I can't remember the time frame, but Fontana is an example. Lake Chattooga in Georgia, I think it's Chattooga, that they've stocked smallmouth for 6 or 7 years in a row and have not gotten a single one back. So once they're established, and once that gene gets diluted into that population, then the pure smallmouths are gone. And that's just what happens.
Wow, that's sad because I really like brown fish. I really like catching smallmouth. So kind of on that same train of thought, do we have any kind of data on how many generations it takes before? Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So, like, I've seen a lot of mean mouths, and a mean mouth is what a spot and a smallmouth combine, and you can tell that they're mean mouths just by the way that they are. That's the stupidest statement ever, but they got a lot of, it looks like you mash the two together. You'll get some are a little bit darker, some are a little bit lighter, but for the most part, you got like these very pronounced vertical bars, but then you've got a kind of that spotted, kind of almost leopardy look that a smallmouth gets, but then you've got that kind of shorter frontal face with the little bit bigger mouth. Normally their mouths are really big, but so when we get those, and let's say that spawns with a spot, are the babies purely spots, or do we get more mean mouths? Like, how many generations? Is there any data on how many generations we have before you're completely diluting and breeding out, and it goes kind of one way direction or the other? And then to add to that, are we seeing any hope in bringing it back to the brownfish side, like where we can breed out the spot and bring them all the way back to brownfish?
So kind of in this paper that John and I were part of, the scientific paper, looked at it from really almost the beginning of Alabama bass being moved out of that native drainage that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So really, our best examples are Lanier, but they weren't smallmouth and Lanier. But when you talk about those North Georgia reservoirs, like John talked about, like Chattooga and Blue Ridge, and I think Nautilus might be one of those. There's 2 or 3 up there that Georgia DNR has been working on. It's 25 to 30 years, maybe at the max. I know Georgia DNR has told us in meetings that they've got some of those reservoirs that they haven't caught a smallmouth bass in like 10 or 15 years. And they're out there every year sampling for these things. And as John said, I think, John, it might have been Blue Ridge I know Blue Ridge was one of them they put smallmouth in. They tried to put smallmouth back in. Another track we could go down, but stocking black bass, just in general, the black bass species it's not a low return proposition for a lot of reasons. We've seen that over the years. We just don't see a whole lot of results from doing that. I'm not sure where we're at on that. We're trying that. But now the issue you run into when you're trying to do that is you've got to find genetically pure smallmouth. And if you've got all these contaminated populations across your basins, finding those uncontaminated fish is hard. So you have to do genetic testing on the front end of your brood fish to make sure, okay, these are pure smallmouth bass. But to get to your question, I think where we're going to get eventually with the genetics folks is they're going to be able to backtrack this, chronologically, like you see a lot with, them now being able to take someone's DNA and find out what, continent their ancestors came from, for instance. And sort of that type of stuff. We're not there yet, but a lot of the early introductions in the 70s and into the 80s occurred outside of this genetic technology that we have now. The scary part is when we start looking at fish here, a lot of the fish that were field identified as either smallmouth bass or they predominantly smallmouth bass, like maybe they looked a little off, but they look like smallmouth bass, given, any other evidence of anything else. When we start looking at them genetically, I mean, they're just a mix. I think it was Santitla in 2017. I think all the fish that they had as field identified smallmouth, none of them were pure smallmouth. They were mixed at some level. John mentioned Fontana's that way over here. James has turned that way on the Atlantic slope. That's probably our other big smallmouth lake at the head of the Catawba. Getting a lot of mean mouse out there. And I mean, absent of some technology that John and I probably aren't aware of tonight, I mean, I don't, there's nothing to stop this right now out there. There might be some limiting factors, and we can speculate on that as to how far and wide ranging this goes. But at least for North Carolina and Tennessee, those limiting factors aren't there.
Yeah. No, yeah, they love it. They love it here. There's something about it. Like they get going, and when they're going, they're gone. And that's interesting. John, you're still not done there. You got anything?
Oh no, I was just laughing about it's giddy up and go time for them. They're one thing about the genetics thing, it's hard for us to tell what they are without doing a genetic analysis. And how that works is if you string out the DNA molecule, most folks realize that's billions of strands and individual loci and that a million times more combinations, but they've been able to narrow down a few spots on that and look at the individual proteins in that DNA. So what do you have? The GATC, guanine, adenine, thylacine, and cytosine. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, and then if you have two matching ones, let's say you have an A and A, that's called homozygous. And if you have an A and a T, that's heterozygous. So they can look at those locations on the fish's DNA, and if it's, let's say it's an A and a T, they say, oh, well, that's definitely an Alabama bass. And they go to another spot and they say, well, that's a C and an A. Well, that's definitely Alabama bass. And you go to another spot and it's instead of an A and an A, it's an A and a C, and say, well, that's smallmouth. So there's about, I forget how many, 80 something locations where they can look at that and tell. So when those things breed with each other, those homozygous locations automatically become heterozygous because you have a double A with a double T. And if that fish has an A and a T in that specific spot, then we know that's a hybrid between those two species, or we can be pretty sure. What is it, 99% or whatever they say in those genetic tests. So that's kind of what folks are looking at, and most of that work's done in labs that our agencies don't own. It's just we pay to have those analyses done. So anyway, I can't remember where I was going, but that's kind of like, it's pretty complicated, but it's actually kind of simple, because if we know that fish is this fish because it can't be anything else based on those spots on the DNA strand.
Yeah.
And
that's fifth grade science. It's Punnett squares. It's fun. I used to teach that. It's my kids loved it too, because we always had fun trying to figure out when they had kids, if they're if they had blue eyes and their partner had brown eyes and all the stuff. So that's good old fashioned that's fifth grade science right there. But yeah, it's so essentially, to reiterate what both of you guys have said and kind of tell you what I've heard, is that at this point, if you have the breeding, if you have the spawning of Alabamas and smallmouths, once that happens, it's kind of, there's no turning back. Eventually, you're just going to have all Alabama spotted bass, or a hybridization to the point where it's going to be almost unidentifiable that there was ever a brown fish somewhere back in the lineage of that fish, which is, John, you saw me shaking my head. It sucks because it's like I start thinking about, and to answer this question, because we did have a comment come through. Darius King asked, "Are they in the Tennessee River system?" Yes, they're in Watts Bar. Watts Bar is the Tennessee River system. They're in Parksville, which dumps into Ocoee. Ocoee dumps in Hiwassee. Hiwassee dumps into Chickamauga. So they're there as well. I've heard they're in Nickajack. Actually, I've not heard. I've caught one in Nickajack. So they are in Nickajack. Which eventually probably means that they're going to go to Gunnersville. And then at that point, they're back in Alabama. So good for them, or whatever that looks like. It's not good, but you get what I'm saying. We'll give them Crimson Tide loving cousin, never mind, them people, their bass back. But yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, when I think about it, it scares me, because I think, like you said, Watauga, South Holston, then we get up into Virginia and like the New River, and then we go into North Carolina. I mean, and it's like you start thinking about and I don't, maybe I'm the only one that thinks about it this way. They all eventually flow together in some shape, form, or fashion. I mean, for the most part, right? I mean, there's definitions between North Carolina and Tennessee, but like they all kind of eventually flow into something bigger, where we have to start worrying about large reservoirs, large rivers, these areas that have been historically smallmouth bass. Like, people go there to catch smallmouth. It's like the New River. There's just a kayak tournament there. The Hobie had the tournament there. Everybody goes there and they're like, brownfish, smallmouth, catching smallmouth. I had some buddies that did a trip there. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it. But they went to a couple rivers in West Virginia known for big smallmouth. And if those spots get in there, they're not going to be known for big smallmouth anymore. They're just going to have spotted bass in them. And that, I don't know, it scares me. I guess I know it scares y'all. I guess it's scary is the right term, or, it's intimidating to think about. It's kind of intimidating to think about where we go. But it leads me kind of to my next question. As prolific as they are, has there been any science or studies that show their inability to go a certain latitude north? So, like, do we have to worry about them in the Great Lakes? Do we have to worry about them in areas that, they get ice over their head 6 months out of the year? Or is that something we've yet to see? We've just yet to see that happen.
Yeah, so that's one of the big questions that we've got a group of us the multiple states. It started out as North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, and we tried to rope in a lot of states outside the area. So now we've got people from Indiana, we've got people from West Virginia on this working group. We're actually meeting next week online. We try to meet about twice a year, and talk about these things. But to your point, I mean, so there's two ways to answer that question. One is to see it actually happen on the ground, which we don't want to see. And then there's probably, theoretically maybe some lab experiments that somebody could do to look at that and get a little closer to that answer. But that's really the huge scare. I mean, for North Carolina, I won't speak for Tennessee, but North Carolina, there are not many drainages. I put it down the other day. There are not many drainages where we don't have Alabama bass at some level. And their impacts are kind of varied. And over time, I guess it'll all sort itself out. But for us, I mean, we're in the middle of it. But yeah, when you get up to the Great Lakes, you get up to the Susquehanna River, the Delaware River, those Finger Lakes in New York, Lake Champlain. I mean, and again, I think the thing that needs to be stressed in all this is that so there's this ecological impact of these fish. But when we talk about these widespread areas, for them to get there, realistically, it's got to take people moving them. And that's what's got to stop. Is there's got to be some will among anglers to stop moving these fish. I liken it to the will that came into the bass fishing arena in the 60s and 70s when we went to catch and release. It wasn't something that states mandated. It wasn't something that regulations mandated. It was a movement within the bass fishing community. And we need that same ethic, that same thought process with not moving fish, particularly these Alabama bass, because once they get in there, we can't get them out. I mean, we just can't.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I do these podcasts. That's why I'm the squeaky wheel. John knows I love to be a squeaky wheel and make as much noise as I can. And I think we're getting to a point where I know for me, and it's hard to do this, and it's hard to do this with some couth and some responsibility, but it's like we're going to have to start calling some people on their crap and just being like, hey, this is the people who are doing it. We've got to stop this. And if you see somebody doing it, I hate to be the guy that's like, be a rat, but be a little bit of a rat because that's the title of this. We're killing our own lakes. We're killing our fisheries. That's what we're doing. Like we as anglers, and I'm not saying everybody, because it's not us. It's not people over in the comment section, probably for the most part. But hopefully there's some guy that stumbles across this podcast or stumbles across this live stream and he goes, man, I really like them Alabama spots. Let me see what these guys have to say. And then he's going, oh my God, I've been putting those in this river because, and it was just ignorance, it was just pure not understanding.
Yep.
And I think more than anything, that's what we're dealing with is I think there's a big segment of people who understand exactly what they're doing and they just don't care. And maybe they disagree with the science, right? It's cool to say that. That's like a cool thing that we say. We disagree with the science, which we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, there's people who just say they don't like it, right? And they think that they know better than the dudes who are doing the actual science. And this kind of science, when it comes to fisheries and it comes to biology, is complicated, but it's also simple. Like if we know that we put this thing in here and this thing will breed out native smallmouth, well, that's not that complicated. A dog could understand that. Like, don't do that. That's bad. It's like, don't touch the hot stove. It will burn you. And that's kind of what we're playing with here is a hot stove that's going to burn us. And so, yeah, that's why we're having this conversation is that, we have to do that. We as anglers are killing our own lakes and our own streams by being ignorant, by not just taking a little bit of time to understand how fragile biologies and biological areas and ecosystems and biomes are. This is again 5th grade biology. We talk about this. If you take out a predator out of a food web, that food web will collapse. If you take out a prey item out of the food web will collapse. That or you introduce something into a food web that never belonged there before, and you totally blow the food web up, and it turns into you can collapse a whole different system. And so. Yeah. I don't know what to do more than have the squeaky wheel conversation. You know what I mean? And just to do this and to talk about it as much as I can. And I know there's so many people that send me messages that really love this and appreciate it. And then there's some people that send me messages that they don't like this conversation very much because they want the Alabama spots around. And I don't know. I'm trying my best to kind of figure out the best way to educate people without just finally starting to crack some heads and just be like, y'all are idiots and we got to stop doing that, And
well, I think I was going to say real quick too, the other thing is like talk about test cases. Right now, North Georgia is that test case where we've seen those smallmouth just go away.
Yeah.
Because that was really probably the first place that Alabama bass got put in where you had smallmouth in there. You're seeing that every day in Western North Carolina. And at some point, 10, 15 years down the road, we'll have lakes that are going to be like North Georgia in Western North Carolina. Unfortunately, Tennessee's probably going to follow suit in some level. And it's hard to say exactly what the fallout will be. Like, there will be possibly some smallmouth left in places, but we just don't know. And I think it's one of those, playing the odds deals, right? We've seen this already, and it's bad. And what we haven't seen are these good cases, particularly as it relates to smallmouth, to balance that out. Sometimes you can make the either or argument, but in this case, to me, you can't. And I appreciate what you're trying to do because as agency biologists, we got a lot of training, we've got a lot of experience, but a lot of people don't recognize us as much as they do the folks that run fishing shows and podcasts and that are, really our professional anglers. I really hope some of our well-known professional anglers at some point will see this and take this mantle up a little bit. I've talked to Gene Gilliland about that. He's aware of it. We need one or two of those type folks to really get behind this. And it's not going to stop it, but it's going to go a long way, I think, to helping the problem. And I'm sorry, John, I went on too long.
No, well, and John, I'm going to interrupt you too. Lawrence, I agree. And I think that sorry, John's down here in timeout. I love it. It's just like poor John. He's just like he's sitting there and he's like, it's what's funny is people just listen on podcasts for him. John's like shaking his head, yes, and then it's like no when we say something bad, and then it's like yes when he's like yeah, and then he'll give a shrug and a smile. It's just like a lot of expression you're not getting on the podcast, and now we just got a double thumbs up. But no, Lawrence, I agree, and that's one thing that I've talked to Gene about it. I've talked to Steve Barden over at the MLF. Those are conversations that it was like the MLF when they were on Norman, and it's like now this probably will never happen, and this kind of goes off a comment that's over here in the comment section. It says just declare a no release on Alabama bass. You got to realize how many people would never follow that, and a lot of people won't follow that because of, and this is something that I've brought up in my podcast several times of. Kind of like you said, in the 60s, we went to this catch and release of everything black bass model. And now it's like we've got to kind of draw back on that a little bit and start getting back into it's okay to keep some bass because keeping bass helps to grow big bass. And then it also can hopefully try to make a dent in this problem that we're dealing with. And so not only do we have to educate on that front, because if you put up a site, if you say, hey, no release order on Alabama bass, there's going to be so many people who are just like, no, it's a bass. I don't eat bass. And I've had those comments on my videos. I did a video where I kept and ate Alabama bass. And man, you would have thought I was kicking puppies and like turning over porta potties. I mean, it was just, people hated to see that because it's a bass and it's this indoctrination literally since the 60s of we catch and release everything. And then the second part of that is, like I said, going back to the Norman thing, I would have loved to have seen while the MLF was there. And I think the MLF was the perfect organization to do it. And they didn't do this because of metrics and just the whole part of it being a public thing. I would have loved if every time they caught, an Alabama spot, it was like, okay, we're going to keep and eat this thing because we're the organization of conservation. We're the catch and release organization. We're the catch, weigh, release. We don't put them in a live well. We do all these extra things. So we're going to do this one extra thing too, which is we're going to put a knife to this thing and we're having a fish fry when we get back to the boat ramp. And I would have loved to have seen that. And I think MLF, if anybody, could have pulled it off. But again, it's just changing the metrics around that. And I truly believe that if you keep being squeaky, you keep being the squeaky wheel, you keep bringing up the conversation, you keep pushing for that we could possibly see that, especially with guys like Steve Barden. And I'm not, harping on Gene. I love Gene. It's just that Steve Barden in particular, and the way that his mind works and the way that he thinks, like he would be super willing and open to an idea like that. Not that Gene wouldn't. I've not had this conversation with Gene enough to know his opinion on this, but I just know Steve and the conversation I had with him, he's like, yeah, you need to kill and eat bass. It's just part of it. That's how we grow bigger fish. And so I agree, Lawrence. I mean, I think that's when we can finally get, again, I think social media is your number one thing. I think podcasts, I think having conversations, I think me getting more guys on my end to be willing to have these conversations. Because I'll be honest, there's very few podcasts, there's very few YouTube dudes who have this much passion about it like I do. And it's not to toot my own horn. It's just I don't see anybody else out there doing it like I'm doing it. And so the more dudes I can get to start to care about it, the more we can make an impact. The more views we can get on this, the more eyes we can get on this. And the ultimate tool to do that is social media. I mean, this podcast will end up probably getting cumulatively, 10,000 listens across everything that I do. And I mean, and that's not including all the shorts that we can pull from this and, put out the small blurbs and put out little posts and things like that just to get people's minds heading in that direction. Then, too, to go off what you said, Lawrence, if we can get the sticker boys plugged into this. I love to call them sticker boys. Hunter Shyrock is my favorite one to call a sticker boy. But anyway, if we can plug those dudes into it as well, then we've got that dynamic duo. And I think the biggest thing there, and I'm talking way too much and going down a rabbit hole here, but it's a conversation I had with Steve Owens last week too. We have to put our egos aside. We have to put our egos aside. We have to put what we think is right and wrong aside, and we have to look at what the facts are, because facts don't lie. And the fact is these Alabama spotted bass are going to ruin our lakes and ruin our streams and ruin our rivers if we don't do something. And so if we can put our egos down and work on that problem, I know we can fix problems. I mean, we're it's America, y'all. Like, we're really good at doing things together and fixing problems. But maybe, I don't know. John, I'm going to let you go now because I've talked too much.
Well, yeah. So I can't remember all what I was going to say, but just on the topic at hand right now, yeah. So it's been pretty. I've been pretty happy, I guess, pleased to know that there's a lot of people out there that are talking about it now. And 5 years ago, we as biologists weren't even fully aware. And now we've got, like Lawrence said, all these states coming in and meeting with us and, taking what we've learned, what we've seen and applying it to there. And, they're trying to put the brakes on. And West Virginia is already worried, just like you mentioned, that all the, good smallmouth fishing they have there. But it has grown, the awareness is growing. But the problem is it only takes a handful of people to move them. And if those folks, became the enemy, that would be good. And not that we want to ostracize people or cause harm, but the enemy, like catch and release, like, oh, how dare you keep a bass? The same thing, how dare you move a bass? And one thing that I don't think we've mentioned either yet is that we're talking about smallmouth in our native spots that are having trouble with moving Alabama bass, but just the bass group in general, like there's species in South Carolina, the Bartram's red-eye bass, that they're pretty sure that it's going to be gone from the landscape, if not already a pure fish within the decade. And then you got the Chattahoochee bass in Georgia that's facing the same thing, and it's just from moving bass around. And people's intentions are, hey, they're not looking to ruin a fishery; they're looking to enhance a fishery. I think for the most part. Now there's some vindictiveness out there. That's just going to be, bad people. That's the world we live in. But people don't realize the impacts. And if you just dig around on the internet and look, I mean, bass are wreaking havoc all across the Southeast and the mecca of bass populations. And then you've got these new the Delta bass even is kind of a strain they're talking about, of largemouth bass that's very unique. What is it? The smallmouth in Missouri? I can't never remember the pronunciation. The Wichita, or however you say that.
A Watchtoe.
Yeah, they're so different that their growth rate, like they have different looks, different scales, different growth rates. Like they're definitely a different critter, and the people have moved, regular smallmouth into there. So it's not a problem unique to Alabama bass, but it's the one right now that's causing the most, trouble because it's happening in a large area. One of our good friends that we spent a lot of time at Tennessee Tech with, he's a professor at Auburn, and he is very sharp in this stuff. And he pointed out the range of the smallmouth. So it's huge. So the chances of that smallmouth being extirpated or going extinct is pretty slim. But then you look at these other bass, like the Bartram's red-eye in South Carolina and the Chattahoochee bass, for example. Their native range is tiny. So there's a great chance that they're going to go extinct unless we just keep them in a aquaculture facility. So it's a big problem, and I just don't think people have thought about that. And I think Lawrence mentioned this. I mean, I've been in the fisheries world since 1994, and if you'd asked me then, would I be dealing with a non-native bass issue, I'd have told you you're crazy. And then if you'd asked me in 2004, probably the same answer. 2014, well, I don't know. And now here we are, almost 10 years after 2014, and it's like we're living it. I mean, this is going to define our career. The biologists in the Southeast that manage reservoirs and streams and rivers that contain bass, this is defining our career. How we handle this situation, what we try to do. That's, in my opinion, that's the most important thing we're dealing with right now, is moving non-native bass around. The invasive carp are a thing, but you don't lose species. You just pollute a water body with more mouths, and there's cases where they're doing okay now. Kentucky Lake's bouncing back, and not that you want those in there, but there's very, very few cases of where you're hybridizing a species out of existence by moving them around. That just doesn't happen in our world. You're always adding a species, but you're never, getting rid of one through hybridization. So that's what's defining our careers as fisheries managers. And I'll be quiet about it, but it's an important thing to me, and it's kind of scary because that's just unheard of, and it's happening so fast that we don't even know what to do other than just tell people quit moving fish around.
I'll tell you, that kind of gave me cold chills just a little bit when he said it's going to define our career. I mean, dude, that's big stuff, but it's true. I mean, that's true. Like I want everybody to just kind of take a second that's listening to this and understand, like, I don't think people, we hear the word extinction and we've heard the word extinction a bunch and like going extinct. And it is such like a nonchalant word that a lot of people throw around, but like really think about the biological repercussions of the extinction of an entire species of animal. Gone forever, never to be brought back. Like, to me, that's very almost existential. Like when you really think about it, like there will be a kid one day that has no idea that bass, what was the two bass, John? I'm sorry.
One of them's a Bartram's red-eye bass in South Carolina, and then the Chattahoochee bass in Georgia. And there's other examples, but that's the two that came to the top of my head. Yeah.
But like, there's going to be some kid 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now that they're looking at that like we look at a dodo bird or a thylacine. Like, think about it in that big of a term. Like, think about it like that. We get so, and we've talked about this, John, before, we get so connected to these megafauna, charismatic megafauna. Everybody loves moose and elk and thylacines and mammoths. We want to bring back the mammoth, but nobody cares about these little fish that live in these streams and live in these creeks. I do, because that's my entire, like, it was weird, and not to get weird and existential today, but we were driving. Lawrence, you don't know this, John, you do. My dad passed away not too long ago, colon cancer, and he left me his boat. And so I took his boat up and was getting it rigged. And, I told Bethany, I said, it's like so materialistic, but I was like, but Dad would love this boat the way that I've got it set up now. And Bethany goes, it's not materialistic. She said, fishing is literally a portion of your entire life. She's like, your existence and everything that, your dad loved and you love, it always revolved around the outdoors and revolved around fishing. And so to think that there's some dude that loves catching those red-eye bass, or they love going and, like I was catching the little, I guess they're Coosa bass on the Conasauga, not the Alabama spots, like the little Coosa bass. To think that one day that those are just gone and that we can't enjoy those, to me, that's a humongous deal. And it almost, to me, like, I wish people would think about it more like that. And that leads me into my next question is, how significant of a collapse could we see in the, like, let's say we get rid of the little red-eye bass, like John, like you were talking about, or any species. Like, are we on the verge of a collapse in lakes, or like, let me restate the question. When we look at like a Watts bar, if we get rid of all the smallmouth, are we on the verge of a collapse of a lot of different things in that lake, and that lake is completely reshaped into something different than it is now? Or is there just not, it's just not going to have that big of an effect on it?
Well, I mean, for the most part, we probably wouldn't notice it on the surface, no pun intended, but or fishing with our fishing rods. But I mean, whatever prey item that the smallmouth are eating and the spotted bass choose not to, you can see something change there. But I mean, there's always things that change when you remove or change a predator, just like you pointed out with the food web. But I don't suspect to see anything drastic. But I mean, goodness, you never know. It's just, there's always a lot of what ifs out there.
Well, it's like you said, 10 years ago, you would have never said what you said about invasives and it being, moving fish around. And when you said that, that kind of got me going down that thought process. That question I just asked, it's like, it just worries me. It's like 10 years from now, are we going to be going, oh my God, there's no gizzard shad left? Like, I know that's not going to happen, but it's like, do you think about that? Lawrence, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I would say that honestly, what I would be more worried about are some of these smaller rivers and streams. Because these small, when you think about a reservoir, when I was in NC State, we had a professor that said, okay, name a reservoir species. And, somebody named one and he said, no, there are no reservoir species. And all these fish evolved in rivers, and these reservoirs are man-made. And so they've created these man-made lakes. So when you think about reservoirs in general, I mean, they're artificial environments that all these fish are able to survive in, some better than others. And there are fish that aren't in reservoirs because they can't survive in. But when you think about streams that are naturally flowing and unaltered and things like that, smallmouth bass play an ecological role in those streams. Sure, they're a part of people catching fish, but they also have ecological functions as shaping the ecosystem and host for mussel species and things a lot of people don't think about. And I don't even think John and I really in our group have even gotten to that point yet, where we've talked about some of that stuff, because a lot of what we're thinking about is reservoirs because it's right in our face and it's kind of the bulk of what we manage. But I would say really the bigger ecological effects I would think are going to be in some of these places, these unaltered streams and rivers where smallmouth have been since the beginning of time, so to speak. Who knows what it's going to be, but it's not supposed to be that way. And it's one of those things that again, not going to get down the climate change road, but there's debate about what's causing that and what its effects are and that kind of thing. But we're seeing what's happening with people moving fish. I mean, it's that equation is really easy to come up with. It's not good. Whereas things like climate change and bigger things, man-made impacts, a little harder to tease out sometimes.
Yeah.
So that was a long answer to a short question, but
no, I like it, and you're right. I mean, the climate change thing, it is a rabbit hole that is a very deep rabbit hole, and I've touched on it here and there. But I mean, in my life, in short life that it has been up to this point, again, very anecdotal to me, I'm seeing weather events and I'm seeing temperatures warmer than I can remember them being. You know what I mean? And like you talk to my papa or you talk to someone somewhat older, a lot older than me, and they'll tell you it's a lot warmer. Like it doesn't snow like it used to. The storms storm harder than they used to. The hurricanes are getting big. I mean, we got this hurricane off the coast of California. Like it's craziness, first one ever. And Gene loves to talk about this, and he loves to talk about the giant macro effects. And it's like, for all we know, just these average warmer temperatures are going to a little bit average warmer water temperature, which is maybe playing into the proliferation of these spots. Because like we said earlier, they can breed anywhere, anytime. And maybe it's harder for the smallmouth to do the same. Maybe it's harder for the largemouth to do the same. But these spots, they're just little, demons of I mean, they make babies like I've never seen anything quite like it. Like rabbits. I mean, they just keep on making and keep on going, and where it could be getting harder. And
one other point too that I think we need to make too, because I get caught, talking about spots versus Alabama. So spotted bass, the true Kentucky spotted bass, what we've seen, and I think John can echo this too, is if you get Alabama bass in there, they're going to go after them, the true spotted bass, as hard or harder than they go after smallmouth bass, and you're going to lose your spotted bass, your native spotted bass. John mentioned the state record. Our state record was broken in like 2003, 2004 out of Norman. At the time, we knew there were spotted bass. We didn't know there were Alabama bass because we didn't have the genetic capability. I think if we went back and if I called the guy and said, can I come pull a fin clip or some tissue off your fish and we could run it, we're fine as an Alabama bass, because that's all we've ever found in Norman. We've never found a native, Kentucky, however you want to phrase it, spotted bass. But so we're not just talking about smallmouth. We're talking about spotted bass, Kentucky spotted bass as well.
Yeah.
Removing them from their range.
And largemouth. They don't breed the largemouth out, but they just outcompete them.
That's right.
And so, I mean, you could effectively kill an entire population of largemouth out of a lake because, again, it's simple biology. You just can have so many pounds of fish per acre. And if one fish is being hyperly competitive and outcompeting a largemouth, eventually they all just die. They go away. And then we don't have greenfish either. We only have Alabama greenfish. We don't have big gnarly heads like we all like to catch, and that's my thing. I love catching bass. I love Alabama bass. I think they're badass. I think they're a really cool species. I like catching them where they're supposed to be though. Like I want to go to the Coosa River and catch big Coosa River spotted bass. And as cool as it is that I can drive to Parksville and fish the Ocoee and I can catch these big spotted bass all at the same time, it saddens me, especially when I catch a meanmouth and I think, man, what did the smallmouth population used to look like here? Where these big largemouth that lived here that were trout eaters, what did they used to be like? Because I didn't get to experience that. And again, I mean, I just found out about Parksville 5-6 years ago. And I hear stories about how there used to be giant smallmouth in there and there used to be giant largemouth in there. And it's like, they don't exist anymore. It's just these Alabama spotted bass. John, I'm letting you come up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just agreeing with everything. It's it's just
Yeah.
I have nothing to add. Keep going, man. You're doing great.
All right. So, I guess the last question to ask is two parts. Where do we go from here? And what are both of the agencies, both in Tennessee and North Carolina, what are you guys doing to educate and to try to intervene the best that you can? Lawrence, I'll let you go first.
No, I'll let John go first. I've taken it first all night.
All right. I like it. There you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're individual folks, you're more passionate about than others. And that's mostly because we're dealing, like myself, I'm dealing with it directly. Mike Jolly in Region 3, more so than me. So, not that I'm not trying to say the other guys aren't doing anything. It's just they're not having to deal with it yet. So we're kind of spearheading that movement here because we're dealing with it. And really, it's just awareness. We've talked about trying to have some legislation that has teeth in it, maybe coming up with some awards. I've told this story as an analogy, like if someone a couple years ago, well, every year it happens, but a few years ago, there was an elk poached. And the story goes, somebody was getting a haircut and was bragging about it in there, and they told this person who told that person. It wound up, they were caught because they bragged about it, and there was several $1,000s of awards given to the person that turned in or gave information that led to that person's arrest or not arrest necessarily, but conviction. And that's all good. I mean, I totally agree with everything that happened. The award, how it happened, we need to call these poachers out. But at the end of the day, there's one elk out of the herd, which means nothing. And you take that same person who takes a bucket of fish from Parksville and dumps them into Del Hollow, and you've potentially ruined a world-class smallmouth fishery. And not only that, but there's another place where there's not going to be any smallmouth or Kentucky spots. Like, we're just as worried about them. And the fine is nothing. There's no outcry. There's no rewards. There's nothing.
They've killed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fish. Like you go from, like you said, elk being one individual life to tens of thousands of lives. Now they're fish, they don't have souls, whatever, but it's a living thing that you've killed now.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and that's not trying to point out any legislatures. We just don't have that in place. And it's hard to get that in place, especially when the awareness is low and people don't realize that kind of an impact. And I mean, we can sit here and beat this drum over and over and over, and until somebody who, like Lawrence says, willing to carry the torch for us, that has way more of a political or social media influence or whatever you want to call it, more clout, then we're stuck here, yelling with nobody, with a very small audience. My hopes would be that we could somehow get some pretty tough legislation in place that if somebody does get caught, that they could be, jail time or heavy fines or whatever. At least have an award be offered up to say, if we have, just like the elk, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation put an award or whatever. It says we'll give up to $10,000 if it leads to conviction. And we're working on that. We've talked about in our biologist meetings, and with we have a new chief, Mark Thurman, and he's very open to that. And our old chief, Frank Fisk, was too. And those things, it's the process matters in government, so it's a very slow process, and those kinds of things takes time. But we're biting that elephant right now, one bite at a time, and it's getting smaller. I can see it happening. The awareness is one thing, and there's more people, just like yourself, kind of have an epiphany moment and say, oh, it is that big. It is a big deal. I talk about extinction and what we're doing just by moving bass around. And so, we're doing that with shows like this. We got signs at boat ramps. It seems trivial or minimal, but it's working. I can tell people are more aware. They're coming up to me asking about it. Alabama bass now is a word. People recognize it's different. Even 5 years ago, nobody even knew that it was different. So that's kind of our only the only thing we can do, if that makes sense, other than having, I'll just stop there. There's not a lot you can do other than just tell people to quit, and we're trying our best to do that.
Yeah. The first sign that I saw at a boat ramp, I was like, oh wow. I was like, I have talked to John about that. Like that is like conversations we've had coming to life right there. And I think that's huge. I mean, I think just people, I remember the first zebra mussel sign I saw. And it kind of was like, oh, this is a lot bigger issue than I thought it was. And I think it'll be the same with these Alabama spots. I think there'll be a lot of guys who take a pause because number one, you go to a boat ramp, you say you go to a boat ramp 25 times and then there's a new sign at the boat ramp, you're going to take a pause. I mean, it's something new. You just notice it. But I think they'll take a pause and they'll go, oh, so like this actually is like a big enough deal that they've printed thousands of signs and put them at boat ramps and taken time out to do this and invested money into this. And, you know, I've always told you this, John and Lawrence. I'll tell you the same thing, even though I don't live in North Carolina. I am at the disposal of anything that I need to do to use the full weight of what I've built here to help in any way that I can. And I don't know what that looks like, other than doing what I'm doing, which is having these conversations, talking with you guys. I worked up a petition not too long ago for another issue. Got several thousand people to sign it and send it in to the governor. It was not an issue with fisheries, but I mean we can do that. I think those are the things as citizens and anglers, and if we and this is something I promote all the time. If we want to have a seat at the table, and we want to have a say in what goes on, or not even a say in what goes on, but just at least have our opinion heard. Those are the things that we've got to do. And I think that with an issue like Alabama bass, if again we can drop our egos and all work together on this one, we have an even bigger seat at a table as bass anglers to start making differences in the things that we want to see done. And John, we've had that conversation a bunch. I mean, we've had that conversation, like, what can we do different? It's just be that squeaky wheel, send that email, do that just a little bit of extra step to just let your voice be heard.
So. Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking too, while we were talking, we've got, and Lawrence will probably touch on this too, but not only that kind of thing, but also going back to the scientific side of it. We, like Lawrence mentioned, we published that paper. It's out there. Profs and students and future biologists go through the literature and they're spreading the word. There's a couple papers out there. I think Robert Montgomery actually interviewed Lawrence a few years ago. It's in a BASS magazine article. So there's some of that stuff out there like that. But, really what happens is what is this guy's new song here? Rich Men, North of Richmond. Yeah. I mean, that's taking the social media by storm. And, that's the kind of thing that it would take. Not, I'm sure it would never happen to that extent, but just something that just got people thinking and could, give that a shot in the arm to just get going and let people realize it's a bad thing. And I'll let Lawrence talk. He's got a lot of good stuff, ideas too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of the same things here that Tennessee's doing. I mean, we've got signs. We took us a while to get where we wanted to be on signs. They're here. We're just getting ready to roll them out, put them out at our boat ramps because some fisheries are largemouth only fish, or largemouth and no smallmouth. We kind of tailored the signs to the particular fish complex that was in the lake. So you'll see different signs in Western North Carolina than you will in Central North Carolina, but all of them say, don't release Alabama bass into the lake. And we've tried. We've got our own podcast, and we in our agency we've tried to talk about it a little bit. I think if we haven't yet, we're getting ready to. Like John said, we've been on other podcasts. Enforcement wise, it's just extremely difficult. I mean, we have a law here, just like most states do, that you cannot release fish into public waters without a permit. But it's really hard. And again, it only takes a couple, right? Mm-hmm. So there's got to be some legal, ramifications for people doing it, but it really comes down to will. What are people willing to do and not willing to do? Mm. And Steve Salmons, I'll go off on another track, who's our co-author, kind of the lead author on that paper, is a professor at Auburn. He brings up, John's point about the range of smallmouth is a great one that Steve brings up. Another one that he brought up, he and I were on a podcast together, is that, there's a lot of money being devoted towards Asian carp, non-native carp. There's a lot of money that got into the snakehead game when snakeheads got into the Potomac, and all that's well and good, but at the end of the day, the ecological damage that both those complexes have done is minimal compared to where all this is headed with Alabama bass. When you talk about the elimination of smallmouth bass and spotted bass across a good part of their range. And so, I'm not going to lobby for legislation or funding, so to speak, but awareness, as John said, is really a big thing. And so I appreciate the opportunity to get in front of a different audience, which is what you give us tonight. That maybe, I know I haven't been in front of your audience before. So anytime we can diversify that and get it to different people, different, whoever listens to this podcast may not listen to anything else I've ever been on or John's been on. And then if we can get on some other podcasts, and we're trying to do that. But, bass anglers, the club system with bass fishing has broken down, I think, the traditional clubs with social media and with the internet and that kind of thing, they don't meet as much. So we still try to get out and talk to some clubs, but it's really gone to, the different avenues of social media. And that's always changing. You almost need, as a biologist, and we have social media folks that kind of help us get that out. But yeah, it's a tough problem. It really is a tough one to come at through traditional methods, through the methods that, John and I sort of were taught in school, which is science, experiments, regulations, those kinds of things. Not an easy recipe for Alabama bass.
Yeah, no, and it's weird times we live in. And I tell people all the time, the power of social media is a terrifying thing. When somebody can go on a podcast and have a conversation, and depending on how big the podcast is, literally shape the entire geopolitical landscape of the world and like influence candidates who become president and people who it's the power of what we do here. And John, to go off what you said, I think you would be amazed what we could do if something goes viral. And that's the thing, is it's figuring out the algorithm and making something go viral. And I've tried. I mean, we had a little clip about the smallmouth that ended up getting several 100,000 views on TikTok, but it helped to kind of, some people disagreed and they made that aware, but then I think it led down a road of conversation where a podcast that we did ended up getting, 15,000 listens off of that TikTok. And that's small. I mean, that's small beans compared to, I had a TikTok one time, I got 25 million views. Just imagine if we could just have that, you know what I mean? And I think that, like you said, Lawrence, it's cool to hear that, that you guys are making the podcast rounds. That's a good thing to do. You're making the social media rounds. You're doing those things. I mean, I think that that's the future of getting the message out, because people are really taking stock in these conversations that we're having in these places. And that's what I try to do is, I can, for a year, I did a lot of speculating. And then finally my dad, God love him, goes, why don't you just reach out to the TWRA and see if they'll have somebody on your podcast? And I was like, it's actually not a bad idea. and here we are. We've gone down this rabbit hole, and I've had John, Lawrence, I've now had you on, I've had Steve, I've had Gene, I've had, a bunch of different people on, and, Shan O'Gorman, which is a completely different perspective. I mean, he's a pond manager, but it's a completely different perspective. And like I said, anybody that you got that wants to come on a podcast, you tell them to call me. I'm already booking for October. And so we'll fill up the spots and we'll have conversations, because these are my favorite conversations. This is what I love to talk about. I love science. I love the outdoors, and I love catching fish. And when I combine all three of those things together, I get real geeky and I have a ton of fun. And so one last thing, and I just want your guys' opinion on this. Does not have to be a long answer. If we were in both states, John, obviously, I'm going to be able to do a lot more in our state because it's where I live, and I have a lot more opinion here than I do in North Carolina. But Lawrence, you can answer this question. Say we put a bounty on spotted bass. Do you think that is an effective mode of getting more bass out, or do you not? Just yes, no, short explanation why. John, I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you asked that, because I was wanting to jump in there a minute ago and say that most of the things that we consider a practical way and would first pop in your head is this not going to work. And I mean, you can put a dent in fisheries by fishing. That's why we have creel and size limits, but you're never going to get rid of them. Now, what could happen is you could reduce the population enough to where you might make some fatter fish or, faster growing fish. But no, the solution is not where they are now. They're going to stay. There's no way to get rid of them. You just can't do it. There's plenty of experiments that show when the fishing gets bad enough, people quit fishing. And I went through that exercise in the park too. We removed rainbow trout out of a few streams. They're non-native, and we allowed open fishing. Before that happened to so they just weren't, quote, go to waste. And once the first 3 or 4 days were passed and people quit catching them, that was gone. So it was cool because we were able to do some experiments and look at the population before and after that. And I think it wound up being about a 50% reduction in population was what happened. So there was enough left to where within one breeding cycle, it's back to where it started. So it just doesn't work. The only thing we can do to head off this problem is to convince people that moving bass around, and any fish or any critter for that matter, but especially bass for this specific problem, that's the only solution that will work, is to quit moving bass. And once they're in an area or a body of water, they're there to stay.
Lawrence?
Yeah, I would agree with that. We actually, because true spotted bass are just restricted to the southwest corner of North Carolina, we took size and creel limits off Alabama and spotted bass a couple of years ago. So there's no size and creel. You keep as many as you want, whatever. We hope people do that, but again, we're under there's no reality where they're going to eliminate them from the population. To John's point, another case study, we're talking about trout, but in Georgia, where flathead catfish were introduced, and in some of those coastal rivers, they actually paid their paid staff on Georgia DNR biologists that went out repeatedly for years and electrofished as hard as they could to remove flathead catfish. And they restructured the population as long as they were doing it, but they never eliminated them. So that's another one of those things where, as hard as you try, you're not going to be successful. We've told anglers that, and there are anglers now. There are a few that are there are a few tournaments on Norman even where they're talking about doing that, and they are doing that where, and I've even heard our state BASS director say that he's wanting to take tournaments where they catch spotted bass, Alabama bass, because that's what they are here almost exclusively, and put them in a cooler at the end of it and have fish fry. So the ethic is there, but again, the reality is they're not going to remove them completely.
One more question, and I'll let you boys go. Is there any scientific possibility that we could create some sort of,
I know where you're going with this.
I don't want to say a virus because that makes me think of zombies. Is there any way that we could, okay, so I read a thing many years ago, and I'm probably going to misstate what happened, but essentially they infected a goat with a disease. They sent the goat out. The goat killed all the rest of the goats, and they essentially eliminated all these goats off of this one island and killed them. Can we do that with bass, or is that just way too dangerous?
So this is a question that gets into probably areas that John and I are experts on, or I at least speak for myself when it comes to doing this stuff. I mean, genetically, that's where it's going to come down to instead of the disease. I would say more instead of a viral vector, it would be a genetics vector. In other words, putting something out there. There's some experiments going on with trout in the West. We're trying to use genetically altered trout, and I'm getting out of my league here a little bit, to affect where non-native trout have been put in. We're just not there yet. And, the genetics people, if you talk to them, I mean, they can speculate on where and how and all that, but then it just opens up a ton of questions about what are the effects of doing that? Would we have some kind of ripple effect in other species or other, just doing that? And so, to your point, I think it's going to take something like that potentially, but then you're also running that, like I said earlier, we're running into is, if we're going to even reintroduce them, just stock them to try to keep them out there, we got to find these genetically pure populations to do it with. And we're kind of running out of those as this goes along. So yeah, you're not off in your thoughts, in my opinion. It's just we're a long way from that being some kind of reality. Just my personal opinion.
John.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, this doesn't say. One thing I was saying, Lawrence talking, that there's some kind of so your thought is to release sterile females or something, and then their gametes are also sterile, and then even if fertile males breed, and you don't get offspring, but that takes stocking millions. I don't know. I mean, there's maybe a small glimmer of some kind of possibility out there, but none of it's really feasible in my mind. But you never know, but I just don't think I don't think we'll see something like that in our lifetime. But with this new AI stuff, maybe they can figure it out for us. I don't know.
Well, I have to say the last time I remember they tried to do something like this, life found a way. The females started laying eggs, and Jurassic Park happened. So maybe we won't do that. We don't want patient zero. We don't want to create the zombie apocalypse. I think in any scenario where we try to play God and we try to genetically modify things and we try to, do things that we really don't understand what we're doing. And I mean, there's some really smart people out there. I don't doubt that. But I think at the end of the day, when we start to try to create life outside of how we can create life through just reproduction, we get into a weird rabbit hole and Pandora's box that I don't think any of us want to wade into. But gentlemen, I appreciate you very, very much. Lawrence, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on. John, as always, an absolute pleasure to have you guys on. This was phenomenal. I think it was a great podcast. I think we answered a lot of questions I know that I had, and I think that we covered a lot of good stuff. And so we're gonna get this out into the world, and it's out into the world right now. We're gonna start trying to make a difference the best that we can. And I think if there's one thing, if you're listening to this podcast and watching this live stream, there's one thing that you need to understand is the best way that we can stop this is stop moving bass around. Stop being bucket biologists, whether it's with good intention or bad intention, whether you're trying to improve or not improve, just stop moving fish around, because that's the only way that we're going to stop this problem from going any further than it is. Because where we're at now, what's done is done. There's nothing we can do about it, but we can stop moving forward. So, gentlemen, do you have any closing thoughts, remarks, Lawrence?
No, I just again reiterate thanks for the opportunity. It's always good to get to talk about this. Again, it's not my favorite subject. I'd like to be talking about positive things. And like I said earlier, there are a lot of positive things that both are going on in North Carolina and Tennessee. But for those positive things to continue, we need to get a hold of this as best we can. There's still waters here that aren't affected. I sure hope if North Carolina anglers are listening in our state, again, like Alex just said, don't move fish. If you catch them somewhere, throw them back. If you want to take them home and it's legal to take them home, take them home. And in the case of Alabama bass in our state, it's legal to take them anywhere. So take them home. If don't move them. And again, thank you, Alex, for doing this and for helping us spread this message.
Absolutely. John, you're out of time right now.
Yeah, no, I would echo Lawrence's thing too. And, we're getting into football season here. So just when you see that crimson, color in the big A, just think of those fish as the enemy and keep that bad taste in your mouth and don't move these fish around.
I love it. I love it. I love it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. You guys are sweet, and we will see you next week. Bye, everybody. Bye. Bye.